Thank you for joining us for the RCVRC's 2019 Symposium, Building a Solid Foundation. This is the fourth session, Crafting the RCV Message. We'll begin shortly. My name is Rosemary Blizzard. I am the Business Manager Communications Director of the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, and I will be your moderator for this session. A few housekeeping matters are needed before we get started. Participants have been muted for this webinar to reduce audio interference since we have a large number of attendees. If you have technical issues, please use the question option to send a message to the organizer so we may try to assist you. If you have a question or comment regarding the session, please type that message in the question box. Session 4 will be about 45 minutes, followed by a brief question and answer period. Questions we are unable to address during the live session will be answered in a follow-up document which we will email to attendees and also post with a recording of this session on the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center website within a couple of weeks of the symposium. For those that are not familiar with the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, we provide a compilation of best practices and firsthand experiences from jurisdictions that have used this method of voting with a focus on election administration, since that is our background. The website, rankedchoicevoting.org, and our other resources have been developed as educational tools for election administrators, policymakers, voters, candidates, and others. The Resource Center continues to evolve, as does Ranked Choice Voting. Both are building a solid foundation, and we hope these resources and sessions help you and others improve our democracy and the conduct of elections. Our panelists for Session 4 are all communications professionals with experience in conveying complex topics to a wide variety of audiences. I'll introduce them in the order they are presenting. Bryce McNabb is a 3-time Emmy Award-winning corporate filmmaker, storyteller, and creative consultant. For the past decade, he has helped organizations and businesses clarify their message through the power of video. His mission is to translate business goals into stories that inspire action. He currently serves as the video producer for EasyCare. His presentation today is a recorded video about how the Lego company communicates complex instructions in an engaging way for all audiences. Kristen Muszynski works as the communications director for Maine Secretary of State Matthew Dunlap. She is a Maine native and previously worked for 10 years as a journalist at a small daily newspaper in southern Maine, in a variety of roles from reporter to managing editor. In her current role, Muszynski oversees all aspects of media communication and public education marketing for the department, including social media, animation, audio, video, and special events. Maria Perez serves as the Common Cause New Mexico's campaigns manager, working to expand and implement ranked choice voting, as well as on other good government reforms. Maria assists with elected official outreach and community organizing to advance pro-democracy legislation at the state and local level. Maria joined FairVote, another electoral reform organization, in early 2017. In her role as director of FairVote New Mexico, she guided RCV implementation in Santa Fe, which held its first RCV election in March 2018. She also worked with the city of Las Cruces, which will be implementing RCV in November 2019. As a staff writer for FairVote, Nancy Lavin crafts and edits a variety of written content to advance electoral reform, from tweets and blog posts to press releases and op-eds. Lavin comes to FairVote with 5 years of journalism experience at daily newspapers, first in her native Rhode Island and then in Frederick, Maryland. Please welcome these folks as they tell us how to communicate with voters about RCV. We will begin with Bryce's recorded presentation. Please note that you may experience some choppiness in the video streaming, especially if connected to our session via Wi-Fi. We apologize in advance, and a clearer version will be available on the future recording of this session. Thank you.
Communication puts an idea into action, and clear communication helps us to rally people around us to enact change. It allows us to accomplish our goals and to solve problems. Say, for example, you want a cup of coffee. You go to a barista and you ask them for a cup of coffee and they provide you one. That is a way of simple communication, affecting change, and accomplishing goals. However, our problem is that life is complex. And the problems worth solving in life are pretty complicated. It takes a while for us to actually dive into them to find solutions that are effective. So what we need to understand is how to communicate complex ideas in a simple way so that it sticks with our audience and enacts change. Because if we don't, we risk confusing them, and confusion is painful. It's why this emoji exists. How awesome would it be if we could explain what we do to someone, and by the time we're done talking, they are actually grateful and appreciative? Hopefully, that is where we can get to today. So as a case study, we're going to look at Lego. Because for decades, Lego has built an entire empire off of teaching developing minds how to build complex models. Now, because of Lego, a 12-year-old can build something like this. I know! The minute we become an expert in our field, we contract what I call the disease. And the disease is the curse of expertise. The curse of expertise is the inability for us to look at our own field or our own discipline from the outside. So how do we treat the curse of expertise? What's the cure? Well, we need tools and a process that help us get outside of our box, get outside of our bubble, and challenge us to look at it from the outside in. And we do that through empathy. Why is empathy even important? Well, for example, these are a set of instructions built by people that don't care about you. And these are Lego instructions. Step 1, defining your purpose. You know exactly where you're going when you get the Lego set. It's printed right on the box. Lego is making a promise to you. They are telling you very clearly, this is where we are going to take you. When we're thinking about how we want to be able to communicate our idea, we need to figure out where do we want to end up. Now, if we're talking to somebody new, we don't want them to become complete experts on a first conversation. That's a long conversation. But what we want to be able to do is provide a level of understanding so that way we can have another conversation that builds on top of that. So for us to figure out where we're headed and where we're taking our audience, we need to figure out where is our purpose? Where are we going? And we do that by asking the question, why? Why am I communicating this? Why does it matter? Why is it important that someone listens to me? And we use these questions to help us build our message and organize our information going forward. Step 2, prioritizing learners over information. So when you're considering what you want to accomplish, naturally you're thinking about who you want to impact, your audience. Now let's look back at Lego again. We do lots of testing to make sure the sets are fun to build and play with and can stay together when they're flying and driving around. Everything Lego does orbits around their end user, their audience, children. So as you're starting to think about your audience, ask yourself these questions. Who is my audience? What does my audience currently know about this subject? What are potential misconceptions they have? What do I want them to know after I present to them? So by understanding where our audience is starting, we know where our point A is. And by knowing where our goal is, we've identified our point Z. But how do we begin to bring our audience from point A to point Z? Step 3, brain dump. So brain dumping is a way of just putting all of the pieces in front of you. So we have to, in a sense, deconstruct what we know and break it down into the individual pieces we're going to equip our audience with that helps them build upon each lesson to bring them to where they need to go. And once we have all of those pieces, then it's time for us to hone in on the best path forward for our audience to take. Step 4, structuring a learning path towards comprehension. This is the step in which we're creating that logical structure. Basically, you're creating your outline at this point. So that's great, but how do we build that path? How do we build that logical path to learning? Well, let's look at Lego. Let's take a look at their instructions. They start with a single piece and then they build out that section, right? And once they've built out that section, they move on to the next section. As I'm building this set, I'm going to build the book first, and then I'm going to create Jack's Beanstalk. And even in building Jack's Beanstalk, I'm just working on one section at a time. The logical framework we need to use here is, in order to understand Y, they must first understand X, or once they understand X, then they can understand Y. So that's what we're going to use to build out our outline. This gives us a broad look at the steps necessary to move from A to Z. And that's great, right? But is that enjoyable? Simply creating an outline, a logical framework, is not everything. It's our delivery process that matters. This leads us to our final step, which is step 5, guiding your audience and capturing their attention. How do we actually achieve our goal, which is effectively communicating and guiding them through an enjoyable learning process? Well, we need to think about the structure of each step, how we're presenting each step, and use a formula that can be found in storytelling, in essays. It can even be found in the Lego instructions we're looking at. And that framework is the problem solution question answer framework. What we do is we begin each step with a driving question. This question places a gap inside of the mind of our audience, because once they have that question, it creates a hole in their mind that they have to fill. Otherwise, it's just going to drive them bonkers. You provide a question which creates a gap in their mind, and then you fill that gap. And that's the process that leads us through each step. I mean, if we look at the steps that Lego's doing, they're showing us, these are the pieces we're going to use. That creates a gap in our mind. Where will I place these pieces? You will put these pieces here, here, and here. Awesome! And move to the next step. That is how they create this enjoyable experience that brings children through creating these complex models, because they're only ever focused on a piece at a time, and they're only ever focused on a section at a time, and each section builds upon itself. You have your heading, and you know exactly where you're going to end up, but it is a fascinating journey as you are led through that entire process to finally discover that you built this thing all by yourself. We need to be able to focus on the people that we're talking to. It's our responsibility as the communicator to create an enjoyable learning experience for them. And if we do that, they'll thank us for it.
Thanks for the video, Bryce. We're going to move right on to our next presenter, and that's Kristin Muszynski from the state of Maine.
Hello, everyone. So just going over what we did here in Maine, I'm sure most of you have followed our process here that we started out doing ranked choice voting first off in our primaries in June and again in the November elections. So just want to go over a little bit of background first so you're familiar with where we were coming from with our communication approach. So our voters did approve the ranked choice voting in a 2016 referendum that was written by the people, and it did have some constitutional conflicts. So we moved on to some legal action in early 2017, ended up getting an advisory opinion from our Supreme Court, and our legislature chose to repeal it. And then we came up with the people's veto that fought that repeal. So we did not, there was a lot of legal wrangling, and we did not end up getting our full approval that we were going to implement for the June 2018 primary until April. So we had a really short time window to even craft our public message and get it out. And by then it had really become a partisan issue, and we were struggling with that a little bit too. We had no funding, so we were starting with trying to figure out how to make this work within our existing budget, not just for implementation, but also for communication. So luckily, Secretary Dunlap had moved ahead with the planning for the implementation, so we were ready, but we hadn't been able to move ahead as you would if you had more time to plan. So come November, we were using 2 different types of voting, because some races were subject to ranked choice voting and some were not. So that was confusing for a lot of folks. They were not understanding how come they couldn't rank their choice for governor, and some of that had not gotten through for those who had not followed anything or educated themselves prior. So we did have some struggles with that, and lock it up a little bit here. Here we go. So our office, we did have some struggle with education because of that, because of the way that the law came to be. So a little bit more background. So I'm the only communications staff person for our entire department. We also oversee the state archives and the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. So it's just me, and our elections division is about 14 people. And they also had to do the certification for the rest of the election, even when we were dealing with ranked choice tabulation. So we were all hands on deck. All of our bureaus were helping out. You see some folks in the back here from BMV archives. We had a lot of help with getting this done and doing it right, under the direction of our elections directors is Julie. She's second from left in the front there. So we decided we would just focus our message on being nonpartisan and instilling voter confidence in the process, letting people know we were ready to implement it, we were going to do it right, it was secure, and explaining to them how to accurately cast their vote so it was marked the way that they intended to vote. And so that was a big part of our focus, and we talked about how to mark the ballot. That part was clear to most people. It's not rocket science to figure out how to rank what you like the most and what you don't, but there were a lot of questions about the implication of the vote, how to strategically vote, complaints about people having more than one vote, and we had to deal with those calls and concerns. So again, having no funding, we focused a lot on our website and trying to put as many resources as we could on there and to update that. We started with doing an animation. This was something that I had wanted to do to explain the voting process in Maine to begin with. We had done some earlier videos using animation. We found this great program that lets you do it pretty easily and quickly, and that's been really helpful for us. So we went through and did that again for ranked choice voting, went through, made this animation, and it was really helpful to have move video because we were able to show how your votes move, how they're redistributed if your candidate, your first choice, doesn't get through. So that was helpful there, and you can check that out on our webpage if you want to see how we showed that moved. I had pitched the idea for it and the script in March based on our draft rules, got some basic feedback and edits working with our elections team, and we were able to record it and complete it for the beginning of May. And having this whole resource webpage online was a really huge help for our entire staff, elections and our main office and beyond, because when we got calls, we were able to easily point people to this and show them, let them go through it themselves in the manner that worked best for them. And then if they had follow-up questions, they could get back in touch. And it helped some of our staff understand it better as well. So we did do the animation. We added some frequently asked questions. These were legitimately frequently asked coming through via our Facebook page or phone, and we tried to make the ones that were being asked a lot were addressed on here for quick access. We also put up the sample ballots like we always do, but this was particularly helpful for ranked choice because of people what to expect and how their ballot was going to look. And probably most importantly were our sample marked ballots, because these were where the big questions came in. Can I do this? Can I do that? This was one of our most frequent questions was, can I mark one choice all the way across? And of course you can in Maine, it doesn't affect it, it just counts as your first choice. And explaining that to folks was helpful to have a visual for them to see. So again, you can see we updated that here for the Senate race once we got into the November election. So I'm kind of showing you both at the same time because we have a limited period here, but for both June and November, we did utilize this website pretty heavily. And we put a fact for people who either read it, watch the animation, want to to absorb the information this way. Again, we're using fake names for the candidates, as you can see again here, Smokey Bear, Donald Duck, really focused on being nonpartisan and being very clear about what your markings mean when you mark the ballot. We did complete both the rules for how it runs. This gets into the really gritty. So if we had folks wondering, well, how does it work if I do this? Or what about all the little parts of the technicalities, we had that right up on our website. We could say, if you want to go dive that deep, we got those right here. You can check it out. And we did put the recount rules as well. That was very pertinent when we had the Poliquin Golden recount in November. So folks were concerned about how that was going to play out with this new system. So both of those were posted. And one of the other important things for myself and for the public, I think, was the timeline. So I did a full timeline that I put up. It's in PDF form, and it's up on our website that shows how this all played out. So if we had folks saying, well, I thought it was this, I thought this passed, this was something easy where we could go back over it and look at it together and say, this is how it played out. So that's why we are where we are today. And that was useful, and it does have links to the legal opinions and the lawsuits, those sort of things that can help keep track of everything. And as far as beyond our website, we did a poster for inside the voting booth with the ballot marking instructions. So if you didn't reference anything prior to voting, you would have something that would be kind of a cheat sheet to show you, here's what happens if you do this. And we did have a few of the things that are no-nos as well, like double first choice and double skipped rankings, and skipping your first choice being inadvisable as well. So this was pretty clear and was helpful for folks who had not prepared previously. And we also did some public outreach. As soon as we got the go-ahead that we were actually doing this for June, we did go out. The secretary and I did a public library tour. Maine is a big state, so we tried to hit a few of the core places where we thought we could reach people. We did 4 different stops with a PowerPoint presentation, and has those marked ballots were the highlight of that, and a Q&A session for folks who wanted to ask him anything about it. This went pretty well. We did provide a promotional poster for each of the libraries to customize and help publicize the visit from the secretary. We shared it obviously via our regular press release channels and our social media. We shared the animated video while we were there. We only had issue with one of these sessions where some of the proponents really start to try to make it a something to tout ranked choice voting itself, where we were trying to stay very above all of that, not taking a position on whether it was good or bad, or just saying this is what we're doing and here's how it works. So we had to deal with that a little bit, and at our future stops we did have to make a note that it was not supposed to be an advocacy or anti-ranked choice voting thing. It was just an educational visit. So we had good attendance. We had some public broadcasts. We had fact sheet handouts at those events. So we think that was helpful for folks and helped get the word out because it got some media attention as well. So for both the June primary and the November general election, we had good luck with social media, particularly Twitter. The media themselves, they're on Twitter, as I'm sure you know, and that was a good place to reach them and make sure that they were getting out the important messages and the right information and connect with them. We were also very active on our Facebook page, actively answering questions there and commenting if we were seeing misinformation on partisan pages and directing them to our site to just get the basic facts and get the right info without any coloring to it. We were during the tabulation process in the state of Maine, we have to gather all of the ballot materials and bring them to a centralized location for the tabulation. So that took us a few days, about a week in each case. And we were doing constant Twitter updates during that process. That was very important to the press, and several members of the public also commented that they were pleased with that via our Twitter and Facebook pages, so they could follow the progress and see how close we were to getting a result. And we put some other explainers on there of how it was going to work. We received a lot of calls, I know, at least in our central office and also at elections, of course, and there were not many of us with a lot of in-depth knowledge of the rules to answer some of the nitty-gritty questions. That might be something I would suggest you help educate a crew on your staff that's ready to deal with these constituent calls. I ended up learning the rules from animation and really getting into depth with them. So I was able to help out some of those folks who really wanted to know what the details were. The secretary did a lot of media interviews, as I'm sure you can imagine, and I covered those as well when he was elsewhere or occupied. We had a lot of media camped out during the tabulation in particular. This is a photo from election day, but we had folks, waiting to see, like, oh, how far are you? How far are you? So we were doing daily updates at least, usually at least 2 or 3 times a day. We are pretty lucky to have some dedicated journalists following the whole thing, and if folks were read about it in the papers, they were certainly up to date and were following it. If they're watching TV, they were up to date. We had journalists who really took the time to learn about the process and fix their errors when we saw them. We'd follow up with them, and they did try to make sure they had everything right. We have some good relationships up here, and the secretary certainly does with them, and we were available, whenever needed to be. If they were calling us at 9 o'clock at night because they had a question about their story, like, I think it's this, but want to make sure, we were available to them whenever they needed to reach us to make sure they were getting out the right info, because the last thing we needed was more confusion over this process. And the big part that we found benefit with was having a really open process, and that's something the secretary is very keen on, and our elections director as well. We tried to keep the whole process just like we would. We ran it similar to a recount. So you can see in the back here, that's one of our TV reporters, not very far from the ballot boxes. We just had a little area cordoned off for the public, but they could see everything that was going on. They could see all these ballot boxes and how we were processing them. And our deputy secretary for elections, Julie, who I showed you earlier, would explain at the top of the process, what we were doing, how we were going to do it. So I would put that on our Facebook page, make sure everyone was clear. If they weren't there to hear themselves, they could hear it straight from the horse's mouth, if you will, and get the details on exactly what they were going to be seeing. We had to explain the terminology, the overvote, the undervote, exhausted ballots, continuing ballots. That was an important part to get through to the press, especially when they were looking at the tabulation results. But we kept it all very public. We're very open. These are the ballots coming into the tabulation site. Of course, we got cameras right there. Everything was very transparent with constant updates online. And during the CD2 count, we thought we might actually have some overflow. So we set up an overflow space with a live feed of the tabulation. So it looked just like it would if you were sitting in the room. We didn't end up needing that, but we were prepared to provide additional public space. So that was something we did plan ahead on a little bit. So in the June primary, we used a whiteboard to show the results because there were some cybersecurity concerns where they didn't want me to hook directly into the tabulation computer to a projector, just to make sure that we were covered. So we went with a whiteboard. We got joked around about a little bit with that, but I told them, it's Maine. We're low tech. We're trying to keep it clean, make sure nothing is affecting this. So we had a nice display that showed people what the results were, and we also did printouts for them if they wanted it to see the tabulation. People wanted to see the tabulation computer so they could see how far the bar had gotten, and so I was taking Facebook Live of this whole thing and would shoot it onto the computer for a while so I could see how it was processing. So everything was, again, very transparent. And come November, I was able to confirm with our cybersecurity folks that it was okay to hook up a projector. We did do that, and that way everyone could see the little blue bar move from left to right as they process, and that process was also sped up. And that helped people to feel that there was nothing going on behind the scenes, everything, that they could see everything working and how we even had issues with our Excel file, and we fixed those publicly. An extra name count, or the computer not seeing a candidate as a candidate, and that sort of thing. So all of those were fixed right under the public eye, under the cameras. We explained to people what we were doing to make sure the count was accurate, because that's our goal. So our only major issue, and it's not really all that major, but we had a lot of press folks who were wanting to get exact times for when we'd be ready to run the tabulation, and we did not set a deadline for that because we didn't want to have it take longer than we expected and have people call us out on some sort of impropriety because it was taking longer. So that the secretary always said that we were going to keep it open and say, we did, somewhere around a week, and we posted, and that's what we did. But we did have a few folks who were over here, who were on us an hour or so, was a little tiresome, but it's the job. And the only issue we ran into with some kind of pushiness on the press's part, I think, was wanting to know the pickup times on the route for our courier to go get the ballot materials. And that is proprietary information with the company, and it's a security concern as far as our folks transporting ballots. So we were not sharing that. That was the only part that really wasn't able to be shared openly, and it caused some press, but we were hopeful that that it was proprietary info because they were reusing the courier routes that they used today, and that we didn't have access to that info, and any reasons couldn't share it. So our biggest struggle that we did end up dealing with was the, as I said, this had become a very partisan issue by the time the elections finally rolled around. I'm sure you know that if you followed it. And we had a lot of claims from the Republican Party of Maine on Facebook in particular. And that was tough for us because a lot of them kind of attacked people's faith in the process, and some of them were just flat out not true. So we were very concerned about those and tried to respond as best we could, and in some cases just felt like it was not appropriate to respond. So these were kind of an issue that we dealt with, one by one. But we had there was some concern. Again, the whole process was very open, so they were seeing some boxes come in that didn't have locks on them. Some of our clerks had forgotten to put their locks on, but had the seals on them. So the seals are secured. They can't be broken without being tamper proof. So we were concerned about them spreading this message that somehow ballots had been tampered with when that was not true, and there was no evidence that it was implying that. So we did respond to that. We had some other really baseless concerns. We had a staff person who had expressed some political leaning the opposite way a long ways before it had nothing to do with the count. And they were calling for that person to be removed from the process. They were claiming that the voting system was secret, that it was all black box. Again, the computer algorithm was proprietary. That was, again, one of the very few things that we couldn't really get into the nitty-gritty about. But it was certainly all on the up and up and based on our rules in the state of Maine for this process. Then they had some that just I wasn't even able to understand. We're just based on a misunderstanding of the rules and how the whole process worked. Some of those we just did not respond to, or I would speak to press off the record and say, I don't even know what they're trying to say. The count is just, it didn't even make sense to me. So some of those, but the press was pretty rabid for a lot of this, so we did have to respond in most instances. These other parts, they attacked our certification process, which is the same thing we always do. But when we did it for ranked choice, it was under a greater microscope, and they were not happy with the way it's done. So we dealt with that. And then we had some other erroneous claims of folks reading the wrong ballots, which is they would not be able to vote them anyway because of the way that the counting is done. So we had to clarify that. And that actually ended up being a good opportunity for us to explain to the press and the people about how the machinery works to feed in the ballots and read them, that it can't read something that's out of district because it's programmed that way. So that was how we answered them. So, in summary, our timeline and not having much funding forced us to produce those educational materials on a shoestring, if you will, and kind of out there and do kind of a grassroots effort to talk with people individually as much as we could and ask them to spread the word among friends and family, to educate them and send them to the resources that were nonpartisan. And we had good internal communication to create the message and get the info out there and make sure it was all accurate and unbiased. So that worked, and it was well received and picked up by media as well. So it was a little challenging, the complexities of the actual testing process clear to folks, and the path to implementation easy to understand because of all the wrinkles there. But most people were very clear on the ring of how to mark the ballot. So that was a good starting place for us. And the openness of the process, both physically and with the media, providing real-time info and responding to questions with facts, all of that built the voter confidence in the process, and folks that we were doing everything on the up and up and doing it based on Maine law and applying Maine law as it went forward. So we felt we kept a good nonpartisan approach to running the election, as we always do, despite the way the things are going. So now, looking forward, we're facing proposed legislation to change the Constitution or to expand ranked choice or to repeal it. We have a bunch of bills pending, so we'll be continuing to update our materials online as that goes forward and do more outreach and education as needed.
Hi there, this is Maria Perez with Common Cause New Mexico. I wanted to share with you my experience leading the voter education campaign for our Santa Fe's first ranked choice voting election, which took place last year. As a bit of context, Santa Fe also went through a long period of time between when the voters voted to have ranked choice voting as their voting method and when the city actually implemented. It took 10 years between the voters approving it and the city implementing it, and it did involve also some litigation. By the time that the courts ruled that ranked choice voting had to be implemented for last year's election, we only had about 8 weeks to educate the voters on this issue. Now, Santa Fe is a pretty small municipality. We have about 80,000 residents in the city, so it wasn't an effort like in Maine where you had to educate a whole state. We had to educate, a small city. It was still fairly overwhelming in the sense that we had 8 weeks to do it. As soon as the courts made the decision that Santa Fe had to implement ranked choice voting, the very next day I went to the city and sat down with a public information officer from the city to talk about how we're going to do this. Like, let's put our differences behind us. This lawsuit is over. We're not on different sides of this anymore. We're on the same side. We're trying to educate the voters. We're trying to make sure that this is going to be a successful election. So during that meeting, we figured out what the city was best suited to do and what resources were there from the city, and then what my coalition of community groups was best suited to do and what resources we had. And what we came up with is that the city was going to take care of, if you will, sort of like the 30,000 feet piece of the work, and myself leading the coalition of community groups was going to take on the more on the ground grassroots work. So the city agreed to develop branding, which is what you can see on your screen right now. This is what the city developed. We agreed that the most important thing was to have a sample ballot for as many voters to be exposed to as possible. And we agreed that it would be good. Let's go back a little bit to the little animals. Yeah, we agreed that it would be great not to have, candidates on the ballot or just to make it boring. We thought it'd be cool to have something fun and cute to look at that might catch people's eyes. So they came up with this Betty Bear, Felix Fox, etc. As a list of candidates, and this branding was plastered all over town. The city also took on putting ads in the newspapers and ads on the radio, and this branding was used in everything. And as leading the community groups, the coalition of community groups, I also agreed that any materials that we would use would be based on this branding so that the messaging would be consistent and the branding would be consistent. So, this is basically the main material that we use to educate the voters. It was this little postcard. It was done in English and in Spanish, and on one side it had what you see, basically just like the sample ballot, and then let's look at the other side. The other side was this. So just 3 basic points. This is how it works. Just rank your choices in the way that makes sense to you, and reassuring people that your backup choices would only be counted if your favorite is eliminated. And then number 3, the bullet there, do not mark the same candidate twice, do not mark more than one candidate in any column. This was it. So when I started doing work educating the voters, it was really important to figure out who my audience was. Santa Fe has 4 districts are fairly affluent, and people, you know, there's a high voter turnout in those districts. People tend to, you know, subscribe to the newspaper and keep up with city news. So those 2 districts were the least of my worries. I assumed that folks in those 2 districts had been following the legal the litigation around ranked choice voting, were reading the articles in the newspaper, and were very likely to turn out and vote. So, you know, I was assuming that they were being reached already, and that my main target was the 2 other city council districts, which have really low voter turnout, and folks, you know, are not following stuff in the news or the newspapers. So those were my my target districts. I also realized right away that one of my main targets as far as education was going to be the candidates and their campaigns. You know, the candidates were going to be canvassing the neighborhoods in their districts. They were going to be going out there, you know, boots on the ground, knocking on people's doors, talking to constituents. And I had to leverage that work, their work, to make sure that they were also educating voters. And the way to do that was to educate the candidates. So one of the first things we did was to hold a candidate and campaign staff training. It was a one full day, a Saturday, and most of the campaigns did send representatives. Most of the candidates showed up, most of the campaign managers showed up, and we gave them a lot of information about how ranked choice voting is different, how it affects the way that they campaign, how to sort of like flip the narrative in their minds in terms of how to come up with a win number, how to ask for second and third choice votes when they're out speaking with constituents. And then at the end of that training, we gave each of the campaigns a huge stack of these little postcards that you see, both in English and in Spanish. So the ask was, when you're out there talking to your constituents, make sure you give them a sample ballot. So that was really helpful. The other groups that I definitely utilized to help me get the word out were all the groups doing get out the vote work and voter registration work. For example, the League of Women Voters and the parties and student government groups and whatnot. I made sure to meet with each one of them to do trainings with that were open to these groups, and at the end, again, just give everybody a huge stack of these postcards. So these postcards were used by candidates and their campaigns. They were left in all public spaces, libraries, stores, shops, restaurants. They were given to the League of Women Voters, to the parties, to civic groups, to the chambers. I mean, everybody had a huge stack of these postcards that they were sharing with constituents. In terms of the actual voters, it was important to figure out what it was that was really important for them to know. What do they already know, and what did I need them to know in addition? So it was really important for me that voters knew, particularly those sort of low propensity voters in those 2 districts that I mentioned. It was really important to me that they knew that there was an election coming up, period. That they knew there was an election coming up and that they should get excited about voting. Additionally, it was important for me to let them know that voting was going to be a little bit different this time. I absolutely did not think that it was that important for people to understand algorithms and how tabulation works. Again, these are, for the most part, people who don't vote even that often. So I just needed them to know that there was an election, that they should vote, and the way that we vote was going to be a little different. That was all explained with this little postcard. Again, it was not important for me to let them know that you know, how the machines and the software works, and how things were going to be tabulated, and who was going to be doing what, and when the results were going to be known. These are things that I think about. These are things that election administrators think about. These are things that the press thinks about, but it's not necessarily something that a mid or low propensity voter thinks about. Having funding to do this work was really important, and I was very fortunate to have some dedicated funding to do this voter education work. The main cost to me, as far as re-granting some money to do this work, was that I was able to pay for a door-knocking canvas. So there's a community organization, base building organization in my city that does door-knocking canvases, and so I got together with them and we came up with a memorandum of understanding of what we were going to do, how this was going to work, for them to do a door-knocking canvas on this. Let's go to that equity ballot picture. There it is. So this organization is called Chainbreaker Collective. They have nothing to do with voting or elections at all. They are an organization that whose mission has to do with transit justice and housing justice. However, they are the one organization in my city that does door-knocking canvas. So what we figured is that we would do a sample ballot on the issues that were important to them and on the data that was interesting to them to gather from this door-knocking canvas. So we came up with this ballot that you see on the screen right now. It's, people were asked in order of importance, rank these 5 issues. So the canvassers will go to your door, knock on the door, say, we're here with Chainbreaker Collective. Would you please look at this and rank these issues in order of preference? Once people did that, then the canvasser would say, thank you so much. Your input is so important to us. By the way, there's an election coming up March 6th. Here's a sample ballot. It's just like the one that you just filled out, except it'll have the candidate's name. So back to the postcard, that is what the folks got at the door. So we really were able to partner in a really unconventional but creative way with this organization where they were able to get what they needed out of this. And I was able to ensure that voters got educated on the new ballot. That was super effective. Chainbreaker was contracted to knock on 10,000 doors. They actually knocked on 17,000 doors. They contacted 17,000 homes and gave out information on ranked choice voting. It was really, really helpful. And again, that was focused on those 2 city council districts with mid and low propensity voters predominantly. In addition to this, I also was able to re-grant some money to another community organization called Earth Care. And what they do is that they develop leaders, particularly in those 2 city council districts, multi-generational, mostly Spanish-speaking leaders, many of them who are not eligible to vote. So what the contract was with that organization, it was to pay for 10 community leaders, again, multi-generational, mostly Spanish-speaking, and their task was to learn about ranked choice voting. So I did an extended training with those 10 leaders in English and in Spanish. I gave them materials in English and in Spanish, and then their task was to reach out to their networks individually. So people, leaders were supposed to go present on ranked choice voting at their schools, at their churches, at their community centers in their neighborhood. They were to share and amplify messaging on ranked choice voting on their social media. They were to go to senior centers in their neighborhoods to talk to seniors about ranked choice voting. I mean, really, on the ground, one-on-one sort of conversations and small group conversations. This proved to be really powerful because, like I said, many of these leaders aren't even voters. They weren't eligible to vote, but they're very much they were very much appreciating the opportunity to have a say in engaging people who were actually eligible to vote and make sure that they went out and they voted and they understood the new system. So in terms of best practices, I guess, something I have to say is that it's so important to form coalitions and have agreements with different people to get the message out. In our case, there was a strong relationship, a strong agreement with the city of Santa Fe, and we knew, each of us knew what we were supposed to do and what the other one was supposed to do, and we were able to stay out of each other's lanes and really work in parallel together. One other thing, let's go to those pictures of the buses. Okay, so that's a little blurry, but another thing that, thanks to the dedicated funding that I was able to do is purchase these bus wraps that were placed on 11 city buses, and we chose the buses, the routes that are the most popular, so the most people would see these, and these went up right away. So these were up on the buses for 8 weeks prior to the election, and you can see it has a sample ballot, it has the cute little animals, it says, vote March 6th, there's going to be a new ballot, this is what it looks like. For more information, visit the city's website. So this was just everywhere, all over town. People were seeing these buses with these wraps on them. So best practices, I guess, get some funding if you're able to. It doesn't, you can make a little bit of funding go a really, really long way if you know how to leverage the expertise and the capabilities of different community groups that can really help you. For example, really working with candidates and their campaigns was, it was basically free. I just had to pay for the printing for those postcards that I gave everybody. And they did all the work. They are invested in educating the voters as much as I was, right? Like, I didn't have to convince them of anything. We just had to get them excited and sort of like create this environment where we were all excited about working together. We all had the same desired outcome, which was to have a successful ranked choice voting election where voters turned out to vote and were not confused. So having those agreements, those relationships with the candidates and their campaigns, with people who are doing get out the vote work, was really priceless. Also using high propensity voters, so those voters on those 2 city council districts that are high propensity voters, speaking to those groups, sort of like the indivisible type groups or the civically engaged groups, presenting to those groups and really recruiting them to help educate the voters. So giving them the materials, also asking them to go speak at their churches, asking them to participate in different trainings and make sure that people in their networks were aware as well. Getting everybody excited and on the same page was the key, and that includes the city, the candidates, the community groups, the people on the ground. In the end, we had a really successful election. We saw a 10% increase in voter turnout from the previous mayoral election in 2014. 65% of the voters actually ranked all the candidates for mayor. There were 5 choices, so 65% of the voters ranked all 5 candidates, which shows me that people really understood the system. People were excited. We did an exit poll, and almost 90% of those surveyed said that they were either satisfied or somewhat satisfied with a new method of voting. People wanted to do it again. I spoke with the candidates, winning and losing candidates after the election, and they were, for the most part, really positive on the experience. They appreciated not having negative campaigning. They appreciated being able to really talk to constituents about policy and their vision. And after getting used to it a little bit, they really appreciated being able to ask people for their second and third choice vote. So it was very successful, sort of on a very short timeline and on a shoestring. We got creative and we got it done. And now we're using the same approach and frankly the same branding to implement and get the voter education work done in the city of Las Cruces. And if the city of Albuquerque adopts ranked choice voting, we will use the same playbook.
Okay, so both Maria and Kristen kind of touched on the ways to communicate in specific campaigns in New Mexico and Maine. And obviously, what you're doing as election administrators are going to be very specific to your jurisdiction and your voters. However, there are just some general tips and kind of best practices to keep in mind when working with the press. And you may think as election administrators in particular, oh, you know, there's a communications department, there's someone like Kristen who's going to be working with the press. However, the reality is that you are the experts on election administration. So the press is going to want to hear from you, and your communication with them can be really crucial in sort of aiding the city's education and outreach campaign. So with that, you want to make the media your friend and not your foe. Press coverage is crucial. Everything that you say, everything that you write is up for grabs. Not sure if this is necessarily pertinent to all election administrators, but you know, if you're sending out, if you have a Twitter account and you're tweeting about upcoming, you know, voter education efforts, if you're sending out a public email, even a city email, depending upon the nature of it, can become public through a public information request from a reporter. So you want to make sure that everything that you say and everything that you write is appropriate for public dissemination, including to the press. And the thing to remember, the way that I like to phrase it, is remember the 3 C's. So you want to make it correct. Spelling and grammar always count. Journalists in particular are going to be looking at that, but also the wider public. And if you want to be trusted as an election administrator and an authority on elections, you also want to show that you can be trusted on things like English, spelling, and grammar. Make it concise. So this is especially when you're talking to reporters. Often talking too much can kind of either get you into trouble or just make it harder for them to understand what you're trying to say, and therefore harder for that point to be communicated to readers. And then you want to make it count. So you want to be strategic in how you disseminate information and to do it in the most effective and kind of impactful ways. And so the thing that I think probably is good for everyone to keep in mind is inverted pyramid style. I like to call this get to the point already. This is how reporters think and how reporters write. It's also useful for you as election administrators, both to understand how reporters think and write, and also for how to structure your own interviews with reporters. If you're helping on a press release to send out for the city, if you're writing an op-ed maybe to your local paper about upcoming changes to city elections, you want to keep this in mind. The basic idea is that you start with the most newsworthy information, whether it's, you know, an upcoming election, when is it happening? Is it a different election style? Then you get into the sort of next important details of, you know, this is why we're having a different election style. This is how it will be different for voters if it's a ranked choice voting ballot first time, and then other general information. You know, a year ago, the city council voted to approve this, yada, yada. The idea is that if the reader or the listener is not going to listen or read to the whole thing, the most important information that they need to know is at the beginning, so they can understand. It also provides kind of a framing so that when you get into the other important details and the background information, they're not still sort of thinking in the back of their heads, well, why do I need to know this? They already know the point because you got to the point right at the beginning. So as I mentioned before, words matter. Grammar and spelling are first and foremost. And then for press releases, op-eds, anything that you submit for publication to a local paper, like an opinion piece or a column or a letter to the editor, they will clean it up in according to their style and Associated Press style. But you can also kind of be one step ahead. Associated Press style, there's guides online. There's also style books, things like how to write out dates, how to write numbers. And the whole idea is just to be more reader friendly. You want to avoid jargon. So in election administration, obviously there's probably a lot of lingo and terminology that to you is everyday language, but you have to think about the readers and the reporters and the general audience, and think about how to phrase things in a way that makes sense and doesn't sound too complicated or confusing to the average person. And with that, there's often, I found, just in political spheres, a lot of acronyms. And just in general, when writing or speaking, you want to refer or to write out the acronym, at least on the first reference, so that people know. You don't want to assume. And then for anything that you're sending that's going out for public dissemination, like an op-ed, like a letter to the editor, maybe you're helping write a press release, proofread. Everyone makes mistakes. That's the point of proofreading. The other thing is that it is, and I will say this, I make mistakes often as a writer, and I do proofread, but then there is also value to having a different set of eyes, a different mind who was not involved in the actual writing to also proofread as kind of a second guard. If you are helping to send a press release, this is just some details about the logistics of it. You don't want to send it as an attachment. You want to send it into the body of the email and without any logos or photographs. This is all just sort of to ease in the access and receipt of these press releases by reporters. So, adding lots of photographs and logos can make it be flagged as spam. If they have to open an attachment, that's just one more step, one more reason why your press release might not get read. And again, subject line, if we're thinking about inverted pyramid style, in some ways the subject line, even more than the first sentence of the press release, is really the top of the pyramid. So you want to make that enticing, attention grabbing, and also informative, while also not too long. I know that's a lot to keep in mind. Again, for election administrators, this may not be your sort of top chore or top responsibility, but just something to keep in mind. And then this is just an example of an emailed press release. You can see that the headline, is informative and short and attention grabbing. You do want to have a quote from someone key involved in the organization up high, and so that for election administrators might be you, and just some other stylistic best practices. Okay, op-eds. If you don't know, op-ed stands for opposite the editorial page. This is a chance for people from outside of the newsroom to weigh in on relevant topics and events. As election administrators, if your city is considering or has adopted changes to voting methods, or even if it's just that you have an election coming up and you want people to know about it, this is a great way to get the message out in your voice. And you have authority as election administrators that people want to respect and they want to know about. And so you have a certain credibility that really lends itself to, I think, to having an op-ed be published. Again, timeliness matters. If you want to write about the importance of education about switching to ranked choice voting, it's better to do that, right after the city council adopted it, or if there's an election coming up, versus 2 months after the last election that had the new voting method. It's just not as timely then. With that, statistics and numbers, I find that in political science worlds and election worlds, there's a lot of data, there's a lot of numbers and stats available. Use a few, use them to back up your argument, but you don't want to overwhelm the reader. Most people, they see too many numbers in a page or even in a single sentence, and their eyes just kind of gloss over. I know they do for me. So you want to sort of choose carefully. Another great strategy for op-eds is to find personal connections to ideas and policies. So if you're encouraging people to get out and vote, and your position is, this is the time to vote, it's an idea that's sort of general, but you could talk about, for me, when I felt really empowered to vote in this election because I felt like my vote counted, or when I heard from others in other ranked choice voting communities, this is what they said, and to me this was the big takeaway. So those kind of personal connections can make sort of larger ideas just a lot more meaningful and a lot more human, which helps readers to connect to them. And then you may not necessarily be the one submitting this. It may be someone, you may again have a communications director or counterpart who can help with this. But if you are submitting this personally as opposed to on behalf of the city government, just some logistics to keep in mind. A lot of large papers will have submission guidelines, which is usually the biggest one is a word count limit. So if it says no more than 700 words, don't turn in a 1,000-word op-ed. It's hard enough to get your op-ed placed, and if you don't follow their instructions, it's going to make it harder. You also want to make sure that you have the proper contact information for where to send it. Usually there's some like editorial at email address. Sometimes another thing that can be helpful is to look up who the opinion page editor is and also CC them directly. And then with that, I have found writing and helping to send out op-eds for FairVote, there's a million opinions and written op-eds being sent to newspapers and media outlets every day. If you want to get published and you've already taken the time to write it, take the time and put the effort in to get it published. That may mean that your first choice paper says no or just doesn't get back to you because it's a general email address and you don't hear back. If you don't hear back within 3 or 5 days, follow up. If you don't hear back again, have a second choice, maybe have a third choice. It's just like ranked choice voting. You want to be able to have backup choices to ensure that your op-ed gets published. And then another sort of maybe less commitment for those a little bit daunted by the prospect of writing a full op-ed is a letter to the editor. These are usually super short, again, about something topical, 100 to 150 words, and they can be used to respond to criticism. Maybe the newspaper publishes an article criticizing or, mentioning criticism of the confusion caused by ranked choice voting, mentioning something about the city's lack of public education. It can be a response, it can be pointing out a missing fact, or it can just be further sort of amplifying a point, amplifying the fact that these new ranked choice voting elections are going to be different for voters, that they are going to be different for administrators, or just, hey, there's an election coming up, go vote. This is just a little bit more about pitching a story. This is something that probably you won't have to do very much of if you're an election administrator. This is more of probably a press or a media person's job within the city. But again, similar to the other op-eds and letters to the editors, you want a news hook, something timely, and you want to follow up, but not too much to the point of being annoying. The main thing, this is just something to keep in mind for talking to reporters, is to know the definitions. On the record, everything is up for grabs and can be attributed to you. You should always assume if a reporter calls and is talking to you, even if they don't say this is for a story, that it's on the record unless they specify otherwise. On background is a little bit different. That means that the information can be used but cannot be attributed to you as the source, or there's other terms. And then off the record is obviously that the information or the source cannot be used. Both on background and off the record, I would avoid whenever possible. There's really no reason in election administration that there's anything that you should have to say that's so sort of confidential or controversial that you have to say it on background or off the record. And even if you are very clear with the reporter about the terms and he or she agrees to it, there's still that chance, unfortunately, that won't prove true in the publication. Just keep everything on the record, and again, just assume that everything is on the record unless otherwise specified.
Thanks, everybody. Nancy and Bryce, some great general information about conveying your message. Kristen and Maria, some good on the ground information as well about conveying a message, especially with ranked choice voting. We have run a little long, which is awesome when you have such great information. We are going to take just a very few questions. Any questions we do not get to, we will certainly follow up and circle back around with our panelists to get those answered for you and publish those with a recording of this webinar. Very quickly, first question, and actually we got the same question twice, so we're going to make sure we cover this one. This one is for Kristen. what is the name of the animation program used for the video that was produced for the state of Maine?
Right, the name of it is Go Animate. On some of our older videos, you'll see it watermarked as Beyond. That was their previous name. But if you go to goanimate.com, that's their site.
Great, thank you. Maria in Santa Fe, you got a shout out. Someone liked the slogan "Vote Different" and commented that it's embracing change rather than not running away from it. Any background on how you came up with that slogan or how that slogan got to be part of the campaign?
So I actually can't take any credit for that, but the city of Santa Fe, the city's slogan, I guess, is "the city different." So
Okay.
the city just went with that.
Well, seems to have worked. Sort of a follow-up question to that. The candidate and campaign training that was done in Santa Fe, was that done by the municipality or a grassroots group or sort of a combination of different groups? How was that training done?
So the training was developed by, like the curriculum was developed by FairVote Minnesota and Wellstone Action, which is now called Repower. So
Okay.
they came up with a curriculum. I attended training in Minnesota that they offer the candidates over there. And then when the time came to do the training in Santa Fe, I reached out to my colleagues both at Wellstone Action and at FairVote Minnesota and got them over here, and we delivered the training. It was sort of shortened and tailored to our audience, but it was based on that curriculum. And I am looking forward to doing a candidate and campaign training in Las Cruces coming up in June, based on that same curriculum.
Perfect.
It wasn't done by the city. It was strictly a community group offering.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. Just two more quick questions for any of our panelists. I will add that any of our audience members who may have a question for Bryce, he is not physically with us. He is about to become a father, so he's a little bit busy. But if you do have any questions directly for him, please certainly send those questions via this session and we will get them to him. Last two questions. What did you find to be the most cost-effective voter education tool or effort?
This is Maria. I mean, for me, it was really, like I said, like leveraging and partnering with the groups that were already invested in reaching out to voters and having those conversations. I mean, that, cost me nothing. And we really just getting to agree on a message on what the important points to be delivered were, and then unleashing people to go and do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd say from our end, we did struggle because we had zero funding, none at all, and we couldn't align with many of the other folks that were out there campaigning like that because it had become so partisan. Even the League of Women Voters had come out in favor, and we had to be very careful with who we partnered with, so we weren't able to take that approach. That sounds like you did some awesome work down there, by the way. But I guess for us, it would probably be the animation. That was the thing that was cited the most from folks. It was a program we already had a contract with for the software, so we were able to pull that off, and that was what we sent people to was our website, our whole resource page, is the web.
Okay, thank you both. Last question before we end our session. Any suggestions that any of our panelists may have for getting this message across in an urban area or conversely an area that may be more rural? Any changes, anything you would do different from one group to another? Well, I think I will give you some time to think about that, and we will put our didn't mean to put anybody on the spot, sorry. We will add that question to our follow-up document and kind of go from there. I'd like to thank all of our panelists and our audience for their attendance and participation in our session 4 of the RCV Symposium. We will work with our panelists to provide any answers to questions we could not get to or come about as a subsequent follow-up. This document will be posted along with our recording in the coming weeks on our website, rankchoicevoting.org. Please join us this afternoon at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for our 5th session, RCV by the Numbers. Thank you again.